Good evening. I'm Layne Hartsell with the Korea IT Times, and I'm here with Monica Granados from Quebec, Canada, who is the campaign manager for Open Climate Campaign for Creative Commons, and also a past Environment and Climate Change Canada advisor. Welcome, and it's nice to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you so much for the invitation for this invitation and for this interview, Layne.
You're doing some work that's pretty interesting on open source, combining that with climate change. And so I want to, you know, focus on that. But first of all, I want to hear about your background. You have a PhD from McGill, and then your work in ecology and how you came to open source.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's interesting because it took one workshop that I attended, I think, to change the course of my life and bring me here. So, as you mentioned, I'm trained as an ecologist. I have a master's in ecology from the University of Toronto and a PhD from McGill University in ecology as well. And so, I was really interested in food webs and sort of those connections between consumptive interactions between individuals in their environment and sort of how they can be destabilized. And there was a computational element just to study these interactions, to model them without doing experiments. And so I went to a workshop in North Carolina that was funded by the National Center for Ecological Synthesis and Analysis. And originally my idea was just to go to get more computational skills because I was really interested in R and programming. And I was introduced to this concept of open science and open source for software, and synthesis of ideas using open source. And it was a transformative experience because it was the first time that I was confronted with a different way of doing science. I was trained to keep your data closed, to publish in these very specific journals. Don't publish anything before it's ready for publications because you might get scooped, and all of these what turned out to generally be myths about being very protective about our knowledge, when in fact, if we're much more open about it is beneficial not only to us as researchers in the reproducibility sense, and just it makes it easier to do our science and for our science to have a bigger reach and citations, but also to the public and access to the knowledge that we're producing. And so when I came back from that workshop, I transformed the way that I was doing science. And so I moved to using reproducible methods through programming software like R. I started teaching workshops about open science, telling people, there's a different way that we could do science, and it's beneficial to all parties involved. And so I continued down the path of ecology for some time, but I started finding that I was spending more and more time thinking about open science and how we can enable that across all disciplines, not just in the discipline that I was working in. And so then I had the opportunity to go and work as a senior policy advisor for the government of Canada, specifically working on open science. And so from there, that became then my career. I learned that, as much as there's still times that I really do miss doing research and publishing, and so neat that you get to sit and think about questions and try to solve those problems or find answers to the questions that you're positing. I really enjoyed doing work to enable science to be more open, transparent, and equitable. And now I've recently moved on from the position at the Government of Canada to working at Creative Commons, where, in conjunction with Spark and Eiffel, we have launched the Open Climate Campaign. And this is a particular interest to me because it's really melding my interest in open science and enabling open science with my background in ecology. And the recognition that as a community in open science, this is probably one of the most challenging but important problems that as a community we should be trying to work on. How can open science contribute to addressing the climate change and the climate crisis?
So data science is, of course, merging with all kinds of and bringing together all kinds of sciences and biology, chemistry, and so forth. And in this case, ecology is where you found that this really kind of caught with you, right? It got your attention, and you thought, this information can get out there. It sounds like to me what I was hearing is that this silo kind of idea, that there's this publishing silo, and the information stays in there, but there's no crosstalk like in the past. Uh, in the past, the physicists were talking with each other, the biologists were talking to the physicists, and so forth. So, going into open source climate change type work, you're combining activism, right, with your scientific training.
Yeah, I would say it's probably like more advocacy. So
Advocate.
I want to give there's a couple of elements of the Open Climate Campaign, and one of the elements is to talk about this issue that if you're a scientist who is working on questions of climate change and biodiversity science, it's particularly incumbent on you to practice openly, because you're working to try to understand and solve one of humanity's greatest challenge. Now, I think about my experience as a scientist, where if it were not for that workshop, I probably would not have been exposed to the concept of open science and open source software. And so part of the campaign is also just to talk about this issue, to sort of set the stage and what the status quo is, and which is right now, it's incentivization to not work in the open, to publish behind a paywall. And, that all that responsibility is not necessarily on the scientists, the academic and research processes are built to follow this status quo, and it's incentivized to do that. So really the onus is not completely on scientists, but we want to first present that this is potentially an issue, that if your science is not as accessible as possible, that it will be harder for people to build on the knowledge that you are producing. It will also be harder for policymakers who are using your science to then make decisions that have implications for climate change. And so the first part of the campaign is to raise awareness about this problem. And then to show scientists that there are tools available for you to open your science, and whether that's the publication that you're working on, the data associated with that publication, perhaps you're working on hardware or educational resources. There are there's training, and there's infrastructure that has been built by the community, funded by different funding, national governments, international organizations that you can employ to facilitate moving towards open processes. So that's one part of the Open Climate Campaign.
You have your background is with acting as an advisor for the government. So you're a key person that could really make some change here, because you can go between government, you can go between science, or you can go between the public, to work. We talked earlier before the show about how to stimulate taking up this knowledge in the public or in the scientific community and so forth, and this kind of moving around. Can you talk a little bit about this, and where do you want to head with this campaign?
Yeah, so the campaign specifically is talking about one of our biggest talking points is, if we're going to solve the world's greatest problems, the knowledge about them needs to be open. So that has to be sort of the baseline, right? So yeah, absolutely, right. There's two sort of like levels of accessibility that we talk about. The first is sort of just physical access. If the public is to interact with this knowledge, they need to have physical access to it. And by that, I mean, if they want to read the research that scientists are producing, which is generally in a peer-reviewed publication, they need to be able to, click a link and then access the paper itself. And oftentimes that isn't possible because it's behind a paywall. So they very much like, subscription to the New York Times or Vogue magazine. Most peer-reviewed publications are published in a journal that require a subscription, and those subscriptions can be very expensive. They could rent the article, sometimes for like $24 all the way, to purchase the article, for for money, and it will range depending on the publication that you're interested in. But that's really not a sustainable way to make that knowledge accessible for every member of the public. And that's just one barrier. And that's what we're trying to address here in the Open Climate Campaign. We need to at least have like physical access to this medium that scientists are putting their knowledge into. The other layer of accessibility is really just to make it easy to understand if we're talking about the public who may not have training in that particular discipline. And so, that's something that that many other organizations are working on. When they talk about science communication, when they talk about plain language summaries, they are working on sort of that next level of accessibility. So having articles that anyone can understand, at least in that specific language, because then there's the other element that science is generally done in English, meaning that only those countries where English is a dominant language or have access to English education can read this information. And so there are certainly many levels of accessibility of knowledge, and that doesn't even touch like accessibility for people with visual impairments, for example. So there's just so many different layers. And the one that we're tackling is at least at the fundamental level, having physical access to this knowledge needs to happen.
There was there's two bits of information I wanted to share, which I'm sure you know about, but people listening in, Harvard University, I think, was saying that, in fact, they were protesting against these journal conglomerates, that they were too expensive, even for these top universities, to pay that yearly fee that they have to pay and so forth.
That's right.
And then another one, Journal of Nature, had done a kind of like, I guess, anonymous questionnaire about how many people have used Sci-Hub, and or what is the LibGen or something like that, and something like 80 or 84% of scientists were using these. So the information, and then there's pre-publications, open source, open science. So some of the information is getting out there, but of course I agree that this needs to be a lot more open than it is, and yet we need to have good review and discourse going on in the background that makes these selections, publishes this information. Are there ways to do this without having to go through these large corporations, like, well, I don't want to name any, but anyway, I mean, are there open source communities that can do that kind of cataloging work and peer review?
Yeah, there definitely is. So I'll start with sort of the recognition of, it's hard to move away from this system because of the way tenure and promotion processes are structured, and the incentives. So the incentives are to publish in these journals that have either very expensive subscription fees for the institution or very high article processing charges to make the article free. And so, it's a hard, there's a lot of inertia that you have to push against to move towards alternative methods of publishing. And there are many examples of new innovations in the scholarly communication system. But again, if you are a scientist who's looking for tenure or for a promotion, or even to score a faculty position, you're going to be a much more competitive candidate if you have published in Cell, Nature, or Science. And so that's always going to be something that you're going to push against until we do a reformation of the way that tenure and promotion happens. And there are organizations that are moving towards that, like DORA is a great example of an organization that's sort of trying to push against and reimagine the way that we do tenure and promotion. But in the meantime, there's for example, eLife is a pretty popular journal in the biomedical science. They're moving towards a peer preprint review curate model. So you first submit a preprint, and then they can employ different processes for peer review, and then it gets sort of published as a version of record. And so there are a couple of different organizations that are working on doing review of preprints. So sort of building on top of, for example, the bioarchive infrastructure, the archiving infrastructure to enable peer review of preprints so that the information is out there as soon as possible. And then with peer, you sort of have an open review process. So you sort of see how the manuscript changes, and then that ultimately leads to a version of record. I think PeerJ is also doing some interesting innovations around the scholarly communication process. Peer Community In is an example of an organization that's doing review, pre-review, which I'm on the leadership team for as well, does do the enablement of reviews on preprints. So there's a lot of interest out there to push against these models. I think the will is there. We have to make sure that there's also funding to support these types of innovations and moving away from sort of traditional publishing models. And of course, again, the recognition that there is just a lot of incentives to publish in traditional outlets, because that's probably what's going to get you the promotion or the job.
Yeah, I can remember doing the master's degree, and at that time there wasn't an internet. The internet was inside the university, right? So
Yeah.
this was 1990s, just before you started to get AOL online, and this CompuServe and this kind of stuff. So at that point, we went to the library, we'd do our lit search. And in this case, it was a medical library. And then we would give it to the librarian, and they would make the preprint, not the preprint, but the actual printouts for us. And we'd go home with these stacks of papers, and we would read them, and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Now, when I did the PhD, it was all digital. You could put it on your iPad. You can do all the annotations. It's a lot easier these days. It seems to me that with some system like this, it might be possible for open source community to really take on this particular system and make it a lot better. I mean, as they say, software is eating the world, so why not publishing? In the case of, okay, so you moved from doing coding, which you said you really like, into more of like this advocacy, political position. What is your typical day, week like working as an advocate?
Yeah, so my work now with the Open Climate Campaign, we very recently launched. So we launched at the end of August. So it's all still sort of very new, and we're getting a lot of just a lot of excitement around the Open Climate Campaign. And so we have different sort of segments of stakeholders that are reaching out to us to talk about the Open Climate Campaign. So, I had a call with a publisher yesterday. I had a call with an Ivy League institution yesterday. And so just talking about how can they help? How can they get involved? Again, I think it's that the will here is there to recognize the importance of open for climate change and biodiversity knowledge, the importance of that being open. And so that means that most of my day usually is, fielding this interest and having some calls. I do a lot of planning, so a lot of project management. This is a pretty big project. So the Open Climate Campaign is a 4-year campaign. And so we've got a lot to do in 4 years. We have 11 goals laid out on our website on www.openclimatecampaign.org. And so there's a lot of management of, what needs to get done based on, our 4-year long Gantt chart. And so there's some project management involved. And then I also just really love the opportunity to come and talk to people about the Open Climate Campaign. So just last week, I gave a presentation to the Open Climate Calls community, and we also did a webinar with Open Access Week, because this year's theme for Open Access Week is Open for Climate Justice, which really intersects well with our Open Climate Campaign. So I also do a lot of interviews and webinars and panels to talk about the Open Climate Campaign, to raise awareness about the campaign, but also, to hit that goal that we talked about earlier, which is just so that people hear that this is an issue, and we should ensure that knowledge to this global problem is open.
Do you have any, just a question off the top of my head. Are you all talking to like schools or like high school level up? Or are you talking to young people, younger kids, or, is it college?
Yeah, so we're not specifically talking to them, but it is a segment that we know is incredibly interested in and passionate about climate. Like I know about the movement on TikTok, to talk about climate change as well. So because we are only it's a 4-year campaign, which is a long time, but we do have very specific goals. We have target groups that we have identified that we're focusing on, and then thinking about if the climate campaign can get more support and more funding. These are other target groups, including the youth, that we would like to reach out. So presently, scientists are one of our target groups. We are targeting funders, environmental organizations, and national governments, because they are the ones that have the power to give out funding to scientists. And so what we are hoping to do with them is to work alongside them to create open access policies for their institution, and then help them in the implementation, and then have that catalyze culture change and changes in practices for the scientists that they're funding. So those are presently our target groups, but there are so many other stakeholder groups that are involved in this question and this problem. You said including the sort of the youth contingent. So we actually are looking for opportunities right now to work with that stakeholder group, and we're looking for support opportunities for that.
I had visited a high school, and I was eating an apple, and one of the young students, girl, she said, "Is that an organic apple?" And I said, "Oh yeah, oh yes, it is." So they are aware of the issues today, and regenerative.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, they're the ones that have to, live in the world that we leave behind. Right. And so they have the most to lose. And so for, they in climate conversations, that is why they are the most active. And certainly there needs to be a place at the table for any kinds of discussions for youth, because ultimately they're the ones that will experience, the effects of the climate that we create as the current decision makers.
Yes, I think that they, I get calls all the time, or messages, from young people, India, Pakistan, Southeast Asia, Korea. I live in Asia, so it's going to be a lot of that, but some in South America too, and of course Africa, yeah, and there is this. There's a couple things here. One about ethics and morals. It's really up to adults to take care of these matters, and not for children. And when I see the children there, yes, I'm inspired, but also I realize that it's up to us really to do something significant. And the children can do something along, but I don't want to see them suffering, not going to school, and all that, which is actually, that's happening because of the movement, this kind of groundswell of children that are acting up, which is I have mixed feelings about seeing this. I feel like it's our responsibility, the older generations. Yeah,
for sure. But, and that's why they're doing that, right? Is to get action in, because there's only so much power that they have, right? Yeah. So they're trying to elicit a reaction in us, so that there is a change, and particularly because of the mechanisms in which in the physical processes of climate change, is that they're difficult to reverse. The effects that we're seeing now in terms of like intensified storms and drought and sometimes flooding are the effects of the decisions that we made 20, 30 years ago. And so the decisions that we make now are going to have an effect to them when they're our age. And so the decisions need to be made now, the changes need to be made now.
That's great. Thank you so much for talking with me, Monica, and I wish you well in your project. I'm Layne Hartsell.
Thank you so much for having me.